In the freezing winter of 1900, a young woman stands outside a nondescript tenement house in the working-class Södermalm district of Stockholm, Sweden. Her hands tremble uncontrollably. This is not simply from the bitter, unforgiving Baltic cold, but from the crushing moral and physical weight of the bundle she holds tightly against her chest. Inside the layers of thin, worn wool blanket is her 3-week-old son. She is an unwed domestic servant, a maid employed by a wealthy family in the affluent center of the city. In the unyielding eyes of late 19th century Swedish society, her child is a stain on her reputation, a legal nonentity, and an absolute financial impossibility. She knocks softly on the wooden door. A middle-aged woman answers. The woman smiles warmly, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. She offers a comforting word, promising that for a single, upfront cash payment, the child will be transported to a clean, loving, rural home far away from the judgment of the city, where he will be raised as her own. The young mother hands over her life savings, every single coin she has earned over a year of grueling domestic labor. She kisses her infant son goodbye one last time and steps back into the falling snow, believing she has secured his survival and his future. She has no idea that she has just handed her child to an Änglamakerska, an angel maker. Within weeks, that child will be dead. He will not die from a sudden, tragic illness, nor from an unpredictable, accidental injury. His passing will be slow, mathematically calculated, and entirely invisible to the laws of the realm. He is just one of hundreds of anonymous infants who vanished into a highly profitable, deeply entrenched underground network operating across the Kingdom of Sweden between 1880 and 1910. This was the era of baby farming, a dark, predatory market where child neglect was bought, sold, and quietly institutionalized. When these crimes finally erupted into the public consciousness through a series of dramatic court trials, they exposed a reality that horrified the nation. The true killers were not merely the desperate, impoverished women who operated these homes. The silent, complicit partner in this industry was Swedish society itself. How did an entire legal and social system allow hundreds of children to vanish without a trace? Why did municipal authorities, neighborhood doctors, and police departments look away for decades? And what happens when a state realizes its own laws have turned infant life into a tradable commodity? If you appreciate deeply researched global true crime told through a historical, psychological, and analytical lens, please consider subscribing to EnterTheCrime and turn on notifications so you never miss our documentary investigations. Because to understand how the system created these monsters, we have to go back to the very beginning of the industrial boom. To fully comprehend the phenomenon of the Angelmakers, we must first dismantle our modern perceptions of Scandinavia. Today, Sweden is globally recognized as a beacon of social welfare, robust child protection laws, and a high standard of living. But in the late 1800s, Sweden was a deeply impoverished, rigidly stratified agrarian society undergoing a turbulent, painful transition into the industrial age. Between 1880 and 1910, the population of Stockholm exploded. Massive industrialization drew tens of thousands of young people away from rural farms and into the cities. Among this migratory wave were thousands of young, unmarried women. They left their traditional village support systems behind, searching for economic independence in urban centers like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. They found employment as textile factory laborers, laundry workers, or domestic maids in the lavish homes of the growing merchant upper class. But the reality of urban life held hidden, systemic dangers for these young women, particularly when it came to the intersection of gender, class, and absolute legal vulnerability. In this deeply conservative, Lutheran society, an out-of-wedlock birth was viewed not just as a personal misfortune, but as a catastrophic moral failing and a civil crime against public decency. If an unmarried working-class woman became pregnant, she faced total, immediate ruin. She was socially ostracized by her community. The state church publicly shamed her, registering the child in parish logs with the permanent legal brand of okta, illegitimate. Employers, particularly affluent families employing domestic maids, routinely fired pregnant women on the spot, casting them onto the streets without references or back pay. Furthermore, the 19th century Swedish legal system offered these women absolutely no protection or recourse. Under the laws of the time, an unmarried father had zero legal, financial, or moral obligation to support his illegitimate offspring. He could walk away with complete impunity, his social standing entirely untouched. The entire burden of the child's survival, social, moral, and economic, fell solely on the shoulders of the mother. Imagine the psychological terror experienced by a 20-year-old maid in Stockholm in 1890. She has no family in the city to turn to. She has lost her employment and her housing. She has no income, no savings, and a newborn infant to feed. If she attempts to keep the child looking for work, they will both starve on the streets or freeze during the long Nordic winter. If she enters the public workhouse, she will be subjected to prison-like conditions of forced labor. And history shows that children entered into those municipal institutions died of infectious diseases at an alarming rate. This systemic desperation created a massive, desperate demand for an alternative solution. The mothers did not want their babies to die. They wanted a way to work, to survive, and to keep their children hidden from a judgmental world. And where there is massive, unregulated demand, an underground market will always rise to meet it. Enter the private foster care market, known locally as fosterbarnsvård. Private individuals began placing small, inconspicuous advertisements in the back pages of local newspapers. The language of these advertisements was deceptively sweet, designed to project an aura of maternal charity and domestic warmth. The ads read, "Kind, respectable Christian family seeks foster child for adoption. Full, loving care guaranteed. Discretion assured." To a desperate, panicked young mother, this looked like a literal lifeline sent from heaven. It offered a way to preserve her secret, keep her job, and ensure her child was cared for in the countryside. But the economic architecture of these transactions hid a fatal, predatory flaw. The standard practice of the baby farming industry was the lump sum payment. Instead of paying a sustainable weekly or monthly fee for the child's ongoing food, clothing, and medical upkeep, the foster caretaker would demand a single, large, upfront cash sum to take the child permanently off the mother's hands. This payment often ranged from 100 to 500 Swedish krona. To put this in its proper historical context, 200 krona represented an entire year's wages for a domestic servant. To raise this money, a mother would sell her clothes, borrow from predatory lenders, or pawn her few possessions. She would hand over every single coin she possessed, hand over her baby, and receive a signed receipt and a promise that the foster family would raise the child as their own. But let us analyze the brutal, inescapable mathematics of this agreement. Once the caretaker received that lump sum, the transaction was complete. That money belonged entirely to her. From that exact moment onward, every single day that the child remained alive, it cost the caretaker money. The infant required milk, food, clothing, and space. Therefore, the quicker the child died, the more of that lump sum the caretaker kept as pure profit. If a child lived for a year, the profit evaporated. If the child died within 2 weeks, the caretaker retained nearly 100% of the money. In the cold, unyielding logic of this completely unregulated market, a living baby was an ongoing financial liability. A dead baby was a successful business transaction. Who were the suspects who stepped forward to operate these profitable baby farms? Society viewed them as respectable, struggling, middle-aged working-class women. Many were widows, or wives of low-income laborers, dock workers, or artisans who were simply trying to earn an extra income to keep their own families afloat. To their neighbors, they often appeared as charitable, maternal figures taking in the unwanted, troublesome children of the city. But behind the closed doors of their tenement apartments, a very different psychology and operational awareness took root. These women were acutely aware of the massive loopholes in the state's legal framework. They knew that the police and the parish authorities did not track the whereabouts or the survival rates of illegitimate children. They knew that infant mortality rates in the urban slums were already incredibly high, often exceeding 20 or 30% due to poor municipal sanitation, contaminated water, and rampant outbreaks of cholera, croup, and tuberculosis. They realized they could exploit this high baseline mortality rate as a perfect shield for murder. If a child died in their care, local doctors would almost certainly attribute it to natural causes, write out an official death certificate, and ask absolutely no questions. Something here was deeply, systematically off. The Swedish state had essentially created a legal and economic framework where killing a child was the most profitable decision a private caretaker could make. And by the late 1880s, these early warning signs began to coalesce into an epidemic of quiet, invisible horrors across the working-class tenements of Stockholm. The date that changed everything arrived when local community members began to notice a bizarre, recurring pattern in certain neighborhood tenements, a pattern that defied the laws of probability. To fully grasp how these crimes were committed over a period of decades without triggering immediate police intervention, we must look at the specific, methodical decisions made by the Angelmakers. They did not use weapons. They did not commit acts of overt, bloody physical violence that would leave obvious forensic marks or trauma on the infants' bodies. They understood that any sign of physical abuse would lead to a coroner's investigation and a charge of murder. Instead, they weaponized time, biology, and severe, passive neglect. They mastered the art of letting a child die while making it look entirely natural. The moment an infant arrived at an Angelmaker's apartment and the mother departed, the countdown began. The caretaker would immediately separate the child from any environment visible to visiting neighbors or public officials. The baby would not be placed in a warm cradle in the main room. Instead, they were hidden away in back rooms, unheated closets, dark pantries, or even wooden drawers tucked away under beds. Then came the systematic dietary manipulation. To maximize their profit margins, the Angelmakers stopped feeding the infants proper breast milk or expensive fresh cow's milk. Instead, they fed them what was known in the slums as baker's milk, spoiled, sour milk skimmed from the bottom of commercial barrels, which was then diluted heavily with unboiled, contaminated well water. In many documented court cases, caretakers mixed this liquid with small amounts of cheap vinegar, chalk, or chicory powder. This chemical mixture served a dual purpose. It filled the infant's stomach, temporarily stopping its cries of hunger through artificial bloating, but it provided absolutely zero nutritional value. Within days of entering this regime, the infant's body would begin to rapidly waste away. The diluted, bacteria-ridden milk caused severe, chronic gastrointestinal illness, diarrhea, and constant vomiting. The child would rapidly dehydrate, its skin turning gray, dry, and leathery, its muscles atrophying, and its eyes sinking deep into its skull. If the baby cried too loudly from the intense pain of starvation and intestinal inflammation, threatening to alert neighbors living on the other side of the thin tenement walls, the Angelmaker had a chemical solution readily available. They heavily and continuously drugged the infants. In the 19th century, paregoric, laudanum, and various liquid opium preparations were completely unregulated and easily accessible over the counter as cheap cough suppressants and teething remedies. The Angelmakers would pour drops of opium onto sugar cubes, wrap them tightly in a piece of coarse cloth, and force the baby to suck on them. This device was known colloquially in the trade as a quieting rag or a sleep teat. The opium sedated the children, plunging them into a deep, perpetual, unnatural lethargy. They stopped crying. They stopped demanding food. They simply laid in the dark rooms, silently fading away hour by hour. Furthermore, the continuous doses of opium suppressed their central nervous systems and respiratory drives, making them highly vulnerable to hypothermia in the freezing drafts of unheated winter apartments. Let us examine the constraints and opportunities these women navigated. Their primary objective was to ensure the child died of a condition that looked completely indistinguishable from the common, tragic illnesses of the urban slums. If a baby died of outright, dry starvation, an experienced doctor might notice the total absence of body fat and raise suspicion of criminal withholding of food. But if a baby died of pneumonia, bronchitis, or severe infectious diarrhea, it looked like a routine byproduct of poverty. Once the child passed away, the Angelmaker would execute the final stage of her business model. She would put on her best, most respectable clothes, adopt an expression of deep, grandmotherly grief, and call a local physician to the tenement apartment. The doctor, overwhelmed by dozens of home visits a day in the disease-ridden, impoverished districts, would glance briefly at the tiny, emaciated body. He would see a pale, wasted infant. He would ask what happened. The Angelmaker would calmly and convincingly reply that the child had been sickly and weak since birth, had refused to take milk, and had succumbed to a sudden cough or a bout of the grippe the previous night. The doctor, eager to move on to his next patient, would nod symmetrically, sign an official death certificate listing the cause of death as infantile debility, atrophy, or gastrointestinal catarrh, and leave. The Angelmaker would then bury the child in a cheap, unmarked pauper's grave at the edge of the city cemetery, completely clearing her household inventory, ready to place another advertisement in the morning newspaper to receive the next infant and the next lump sum. The emotional states within this underground ecosystem were starkly divided by class and power. The biological mothers lived in a permanent state of perpetual, anxious guilt and terror. Many worked 18 hours a day in factories or households, unable to visit their children for fear of exposing their secret to their employers. The infants lived in a state of prolonged, sedated agony, their lives slipping away in dark closets. But the Angelmakers operated with a chilling, detached, clinical coldness. To them, this was not a matter of human lives, it was a factory assembly line. It was an automated processing system turning human societal shame into liquid cash. And as the years progressed, the system escalated. Some operators grew impatient with the slow, multi-week process of starvation and drug-induced neglect. They realized that if they took in multiple babies simultaneously to maximize their immediate cash flow, the sheer volume of infants would overwhelm their small apartments and attract neighbor complaints. They needed a faster, more definitive, yet still undetectable method of clearing their rooms. And that's when the real nightmare began, as individual operations shifted from passive neglect into active, industrialized murder. For decades, the Swedish judicial and police authorities treated infant deaths in private foster homes as isolated, domestic tragedies. The initial police theory was simple, deeply biased, and completely wrong. They believed that if foster children were dying in large numbers, it was simply because poor people were naturally unhygienic, uneducated in basic hygiene, and inherently incapable of providing proper child care. There was no widespread suspicion of systematic foul play. But by the late 1890s, the sheer volume of infant deaths in specific urban sectors became so massive that it threatened to disrupt the city's public health statistics. The breakthrough in the investigation did not come from brilliant forensic science or dramatic detective work, but from basic, old-fashioned municipal record-keeping and statistical auditing. Local health boards and parish registrars began noticing a terrifying statistical anomaly. In certain working-class districts of Stockholm, such as Södermalm and Gamla stan, the infant mortality rate within specific, individual tenement apartments was sitting at an impossible, mathematically absurd 100%. Every single infant that entered those specific addresses died within a matter of weeks, without exception. Detectives initially thought they had their explanation: a localized, virulent outbreak of an infectious disease like scarlet fever, diphtheria, or whooping cough confined to specific unsanitary buildings. They were completely wrong. When investigators conducted unannounced, confrontational visits to these specific apartments, they found absolutely no signs of epidemic illness. Instead, they walked into scenes of concentrated horror. They discovered dark, foul-smelling, overcrowded rooms where multiple infants, born to completely different biological parents from different parts of the country, were crammed into single, dirty beds or wooden boxes. All of the children presented identical, chilling clinical symptoms: extreme emaciation, sunken eyes, skin covered in sores, and a state of heavy, unreactive sedation. The police investigation quickly ran into massive red herrings and dead ends designed by the caretakers. When police demanded to see the official registry books of the children, they discovered that many Angelmakers kept completely fraudulent logs. They utilized multiple false names for the same baby, constantly swapped identification tags between living and dying infants, and frequently claimed to inspectors that certain children had been safely returned to their biological mothers when, in reality, those children were already buried deep in the pauper fields of the city cemetery under false medical certificates. Furthermore, severe witness issues plagued the detectives at every turn. When they successfully tracked down the biological mothers through newspaper ad records and demanded that they testify against the caretakers, the women overwhelmingly refused to cooperate with the law. Why? Because under the Swedish Penal Code at the time, if a mother admitted she had paid a private individual a lump sum to take her child anonymously without registering the transfer with the parish, she herself could be arrested and charged with criminal child abandonment, endangerment, or violation of public decency laws. The profound social stigma, combined with a justified fear of prison, kept the victims' mothers completely silent. They chose to protect the very monsters who had killed their babies, simply to protect their own remaining shreds of social existence and survival. At this stage of history, consider the limitations of forensic science in the year 1900. Toxicology was still in its absolute infancy. If an investigator strongly suspected a child had been fatally poisoned with continuous doses of opium, proving that hypothesis beyond a reasonable doubt in a tiny, severely malnourished infant body was an extraordinary challenge. Chemical tests for plant alkaloids like morphine were highly unreliable, easily contaminated, and fiercely contested by defense attorneys in courts of law. The evidence gathered by the police seemed entirely circumstantial, relying on statistics rather than physical proof, until investigators uncovered a hidden network of institutional collusion that completely shifted the scale and scope of the entire criminal case. The police had operating under the comfortable assumption that these Angelmakers were isolated, uneducated, independent actors operating out of desperate poverty in the slums. But a breakthrough came when detectives raided the apartment of a prominent Stockholm caretaker and recovered a hidden, highly detailed personal ledger. The documents revealed a shocking truth. The Angelmakers were actively colluding with high-end, highly respected urban midwives, private maternity clinics, and wealthy citizens. These corrupt midwives acted as professional criminal brokers. When a wealthy businessman, a nobleman, or an upper-class student impregnated his young housemaid, or when an elite upper-class lady had a secret, illegitimate pregnancy, the private midwife would charge a massive financial premium to handle the medical delivery in total secrecy. Part of that premium was then used to directly hire a vetted Angelmaker. The midwives were systematically feeding a steady stream of high-payout, unwanted infants directly into the baby farms, knowing with absolute certainty what the ultimate outcome of that placement would be. This was not a chaotic series of crimes committed by desperate individuals at the bottom of society. It was an organized, highly structured, cross-class criminal enterprise that served to protect the reputations of the wealthy elite at the expense of working-class lives. When we look past the sensationalized newspaper headlines of the era and analyze the documented behavioral patterns and official court testimonies of the captured Angelmakers, we find a psychological profile that fundamentally challenges our conventional understanding of criminal violence and serial murder. These women did not exhibit the classic clinical traits of sadistic psychopathy or serial killers. They did not derive emotional satisfaction, pleasure, or a sense of power from the physical suffering or death of the infants in their care. Instead, their detailed court testimonies revealed a profound, terrifying manifestation of extreme cognitive dissonance, normalization, and psychological detachment. During prolonged police interrogations and cross-examinations, many captured Angelmakers expressed genuine, unfeigned shock and indignation that they were being viewed by the law as cold-blooded murderers. In their own internal psychological framing, they believed they were performing an highly necessary, practical, and compassionate social utility. They viewed themselves as pragmatic service providers who solved an otherwise impossible, catastrophic problem for both desperate working-class mothers and elite families. They effectively compartmentalized their criminal actions by leaning heavily on the high baseline infant mortality rate of the era. They convinced themselves that since poor, illegitimate children frequently succumb to natural illnesses anyway, their own passive role in accelerating that inevitable death through nutritional deprivation was not a mortal sin or a true crime. This profound psychological coldness was continuously reinforced by the repetitive, highly bureaucratized nature of their daily operations. Taking in a new baby, collecting the cash payment, diluting the baker's milk, administering the opium rag, and calling the busy doctor became a routine, normalized, day-to-day administrative job. The human element, the unique identity of the child, was completely erased from their psychological equation. The infant was reduced to a unit of production on a commercial assembly line. But let us reframe our entire insight into this historical tragedy, moving beyond the individual psychology of the killers. It is simple and comforting to look back at the history of the late 19th century and label these individual baby farmers as unique, isolated monsters who existed completely outside the norm of human nature. But a deeper, sharper sociological analysis reveals an uncomfortable, haunting truth. The Angelmakers were merely the direct, logical symptoms of a profoundly hypocritical and predatory societal structure. The true perpetrator of these crimes was the prevailing legal, economic, and cultural framework of the Kingdom of Sweden during its rapid industrialization. Society demanded absolute, pristine moral and sexual purity from impoverished working-class women, yet offered them zero financial, systemic, or social support if they fell short of that standard. The legal framework actively protected wealthy men from any form of paternity accountability, while simultaneously criminalizing and destroying the mothers who tried to survive. The Angelmakers did not operate in spite of the social system, they operated precisely because of it. They functioned as the unofficial, unacknowledged human trash disposal mechanism for a civilization that wanted its inconvenient moral and financial truths to quietly, invisibly disappear. The state created the economic incentives, the state maintained the legal loopholes, and the state guaranteed an endless supply of vulnerable victims. The Angelmakers simply executed the cold, rational logic of that capitalist market to its natural, terrifying conclusion. Think about this systemic dynamic for a moment. If you were a member of a jury sitting in a Swedish courtroom in 1902, looking at an emaciated, middle-aged baby farm operator sitting in the dock, would you view her as a solitary villain who invented this horror? Or would you see her as a mirror reflecting the dark, hidden realities of your own city's economy? This deep-seated systemic hypocrisy was about to be shattered when the judiciary realized that small fines and short prison sentences were completely failing to stop the trade, leading to the emergence of the most prolific case in Scandinavian history. Between 1880 and 1910, dozens of separate baby farming trials concluded in district courts across Sweden. Because the vast majority of the infant deaths were caused by passive neglect and starvation rather than direct, bloody physical trauma, many early defendants received shockingly light sentences from hesitant judges. They were frequently convicted merely of gross negligence, violating health ordinances, or minor child abandonment, receiving prison terms ranging from just 2 to 6 years of hard labor in provincial penitentiaries. These soft sentences meant that many operators returned directly to the community and quietly resumed their business under different names. But as the public grew increasingly radicalized and outraged by the repetitive scale of the scandals, the Swedish judiciary was forced to take drastic, unprecedented legal action. The historical climax and definitive turning point of this dark era arrived a few years later, in the infamous and terrifying case of a woman named Hilda Nilsson. Operating in the southern coastal city of Helsingborg, Nilsson realized that the shifting municipal laws were making passive starvation too risky. Health inspectors were starting to look closer at emaciated infants. To bypass this risk, Nilsson escalated her business model from passive neglect into active, industrialized mass murder. Terrified of being caught by newly formed municipal health monitoring boards, Hilda Nilsson stopped waiting for the children to slowly fade away from diluted milk. Instead, the moment a mother departed her home after paying a lump sum payment, Nilsson took the infant into her wash house. She systematically drowned the babies in a large zinc wash basin. She then built a massive fire in her laundry furnace and cremated their tiny bodies in the middle of the night, completely eliminating any physical trace of their existence and bypassing the need to ever contact a doctor for a death certificate. In 1917, Hilda Nilsson's enterprise finally collapsed when a biological mother grew suspicious of Nilsson's constant, defensive excuses blocking her from visiting her infant son. The mother contacted the local authorities, prompting a comprehensive police raid on the property. Nilsson was arrested, put on trial in a courtroom packed with international journalists, and found guilty of 7 counts of deliberate, premeditated murder. The judges sentenced her to death by beheading. She became the very last woman in Swedish history to receive a capital death sentence. However, her state execution was never carried out by the royal executioner. Before she could be led to the scaffold, Hilda Nilsson took her own life, hanging herself from the bars of her cell at the Landskrona citadel. The horrific revelations of the Hilda Nilsson trial, building upon 30 years of smaller urban scandals, completely shattered the Swedish state's traditional, laissez-faire approach to child welfare and family privacy. The nation could no longer pretend this was a private domestic issue. Spurred into action by the late 19th century case clusters, the Swedish parliament passed the landmark Foster Child Act of 1902, Fosterbarnslagen, which was progressively tightened over the next 2 decades. This historic legislation completely revolutionized child protection in Northern Europe. For the very first time in Swedish history, it became strictly illegal for a parent to place a child into a foster home through an anonymous, private, or unregulated cash transaction. The law mandated that every single individual who took in a non-biological child under the age of 7 must be officially vetted, approved, and registered with the municipal government. Furthermore, the state created dedicated, well-funded municipal inspection boards. Trained social workers were granted unprecedented legal authority to conduct unannounced, mandatory inspections of any home caring for foster children, checking their weight, their health, and their living conditions. In 1920, the state took complete institutional control by establishing the Barnevardsnämnd, the centralized child welfare board. This legislation stripped private individuals and unregulated charities of the power to manage adoptions and foster care placements. Child welfare was transformed into a professionalized, heavily monitored state responsibility. The legal and economic loopholes that had funded and fueled the Angelmakers for over 30 years were permanently, definitively closed. The tragic era of the Änglamakerska remains a somber, deeply reflective chapter in the social history of Scandinavia. It stands as a stark, historical warning of what happens when a society prioritizes moral judgment and religious stigma over human empathy, and when an unyielding legal system allows human life to be treated as a disposable, unregulated economic transaction. The crowded tenement apartments of Södermalm and Gamla Stan, where hundreds of anonymous infants spent their final, quiet days, have long since been demolished or transformed into high-end, multi-million-dollar real estate in modern, prosperous downtown Stockholm. The names of the vast majority of the children who died in those dark back rooms are entirely lost to history, buried in forgotten, grass-covered pauper fields at the edge of the city. In the end, this tragic historical case cluster doesn't simply ask us to identify which poor caretakers were legally guilty of murder. It forces us to look inward, asking how easily an entire civilized nation can look away from a prolonged horror occurring right in front of its eyes, as long as that horror remains socially and economically convenient for the ruling class. The houses still stand. The questions do too. If you appreciate deeply researched global true crime told through a historical, psychological, and analytical lens, please consider subscribing to EnterTheCrime and turn on notifications so you never miss our documentary investigations.